Hi, grade fours. We're going to do chapter 6 today of Hardy Boys Adventures, Tunnel of Secrets, with Freddie, and Lloyd is sleeping on the other side. You can't see him. Robbie is not out today, but he'll be out for chapter 7. So chapter 6, Ghost Hunters. If there's anywhere in Bayport we're going to find pertinent information about Admiral James T. Bryant, it's here, Frank announced with an especially nerdy glow as we walked up to the information desk at the Bayport Historical Society Library. Frank, it's good to see you again, said the bushy-haired man behind the desk. Hi, Mr. Schneider. We need to dig up some information on Admiral Bryant and his statue. There isn't much online besides the basics they taught us in middle school, Frank explained. I hear it's been an eventful day for the old Admiral, Mr. Schneider said. Not just the Admiral, Frank said. Joe was underground exploring the old tunnels when the sinkhole caved in. Well, I'm certainly glad you made it out safely to join us, Joe, Mr. Schneider said. Yeah, I'm not so sure. Being trapped underground is a lot more exciting than being trapped in a library with my brainiac brother, I quipped. I quickly added, no offense, Mr. Schneider. Mr. Schneider responded with a good-natured laugh. None taken, Joe, but maybe I can show you something that will make the library more exciting for you. Now, it was Frank's turn to laugh. Fat chance. Joe won't read anything without pictures. Very funny, dude, I said. I may not be a hardcore nerd like my brother, but I do like reading. I'd just rather read something more exciting than a history lesson about a crusty old guy. Mr. Schneider gave a sly smile. What if that crusty old guy was caught up in rumors of ancient cults and marauding pirates? Now that sounds like my kind of book, I said. Mr. Schneider disappeared into the stacks and came back a few minutes later with a couple old leather-bound books. We're still in the process of digitizing our archives, so much of the information in our older volumes can only be gleaned through old-fashioned page-turning. Or talking to me, of course. Mr. Schneider smiled proudly. You already know the basic facts about our esteemed founding father, Admiral James T. Bryant, hero of the seas during the War for Independence and wealthy merchant mariner whose grand plans and fleet of ships might have transformed our humble little town into one of the nation's great port cities, were it not for his mysterious disappearance shortly after the town was incorporated. Don't forget the stories about him haunting the old graveyard, I inserted. Of course, it's a rather romantic story, actually, Mr. Schneider said. The tomb he was supposed to share with his beloved wife, who tragically passed away, has 2 sarcophages, but one is destined to remain empty forever. The lovers are never to be reunited, even in death. I groaned. I wanted excitement, and instead the librarian was telling us frothy love stories. But that's all fairly common knowledge. What most of the local histories neglect to mention are the many legends and rumors the man inspired while he was still alive. Mr. Schneider opened one of his books to a yellow page that had an old-timey illustration of a tall ship with raised sails and canyons. It wasn't just an old ship either. This one flew an unmistakable black flag with a skull and crossbones. The local politics of the time were quite heated, and the admiral had more than a few enemies. Mr. Schneider continued, according to them, he wasn't a merchant at all, but a pirate king disguised as an honest businessman who amassed his fortune by sending his ships out to plunder and pillage on the high seas. Cool, I exclaimed. Really, Frank said. I knew what he was thinking, that maybe Sal's story about treasure had a hint of truth to it after all. None of it was likely true, of course, but at the time the newspapers had a field day. Mr. Schneider said. Then the librarian flipped to a page filled with the same strange symbols engraved on the bronze book carried by the admiral's statue. Other rumors, however, may have held more merit, he said. Frank and I perked up. As far as we knew, those symbols were a total mystery, and the Hardy boys love a good mystery. You, no doubt, are familiar with the Freemasons, Mr. Schneider asked. Sure. The Freemasons were a secret society that colonial settlers brought to America in the 17th or 18th century, but no one really knows exactly where they came from. Frank chimed in. I just nodded, pretending like I knew what he was talking about. The title Freemasons refers to the profession of masonry or stonework, and that's where the society gets a lot of its symbolism and rituals. Though some people say the order itself may have originated as far back as ancient Druid or Egyptian Isis or Isis cults. Other accounts say it started with the Knights Templar, the 20th century warrior monks who safeguarded the church's most secret treasures. Frank had entered a full-on nerd warp. My brother gets excited about this kind of historical stuff. He barely even paused to take a breath before going on. The American version of the Masons played an important role in early U.S. politics. George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and Paul Revere were all members. Some of the symbols found on the U.S. currency are supposedly inspired by Freemasonry, like the Eye of the Providence on top of the pyramid of the dollar bill. The Masons have all kinds of secret symbols and rituals. A lot of people consider them a cult, but others claim that they were just a club of educated guys who got together to discuss intellectual matters. There are all kinds of conspiracy theories about the Masons leading secret underground movements throughout history, bent on world domination. So when the Admiral of Freemason? Was the Admiral a Freemason, I asked Mr. Schneider, knowing if I didn't cut in, Frank might never stop talking. He was, but that's not even the real interesting part. Mr. Schneider said, the Masons spawned a number of small secret societies that are said to have ruled from behind the scenes throughout the colonial era. While very little is known about the inner workings of Bayport's Masonic Society, its existence was widely known, and the Admiral and his inner circle were assumed to form its core. So along with defaming him by calling him a pirate, his political opponents also accused him of being an underground cultist with plans to control everything in Bayport. Sounds like the Admiral was one rebellious dude, I said. Who knows how much of it was actually true, but it has certainly made him a hot topic of conversation, Mr. Schneider said. And his affiliation with the secret society would explain all the cool symbols on the book his statue carries, Frank observed. The trident and the symbols that adorn the book undoubtedly held hidden meanings for the society. Though, sadly, those details are mostly lost in history. Still have Lloydie, guys. Lloydie. Lloydie. What about the key of the Admiral's belt? Do you know if that has any hidden meaning? I asked. Mr. Schneider gave me a curious look and hesitated a second before answering. Not that I'm aware. I believe it simply represented the key to the city, a way to acknowledge his role in the town's early prosperity. Why do you ask? Oh, no reason, I fibbed, thinking about the hidden key safely in my gear bag. If there's anything else you can tell us about the Admiral or the statue, the Admiral had turned out to be a lot more admirable than I had expected, but I wasn't sure what any of his rumored 18th century exploits might have to do with the mysteries we were investigating. Not too much more to tell, unfortunately, Mr. Schneider said. A lot of the local histories have been lost, and his prominence beyond Bayport was cut short by his early demise. So he never made it into the national history books. We do know he was feared by a lot of people, but he was also uncommonly generous and was very charitable with Bayport's less fortunate citizens. He personally funded much of the town's early civic development, which probably accounts for the town erecting a statue in his honor while he was still alive and kicking. I'm not really sure what else you boys are looking for. Us either, Frank admitted. But there's one other book from the time that could shed a little more light. This way, gentlemen, he said as he stood up. I lifted my gear bag, which was a lot heavier than normal thanks to Admiral's key, onto my shoulder and followed Mr. Schneider towards the back of the library, where he pulled a very beat-up book from the stacks. Now this came to us in a very poor shape. It's missing more pages than that, but it includes some speculation about the Admiral's secret society from shortly after his demise. Just then a phone rang at the front of the library. If you'll excuse me, I need to get that, Mr. Schneider said. Let me know if you have any other questions. Thanks, Mr. S., Frank said to the librarian and hurried off. I have to admit, if the history they taught at school was this interesting, I might actually have paid attention in class, I told Frank once we were alone in the stacks. But it doesn't really help us understand what the Admiral or a statue has to do with Sal or Layla's disappearance. Frank finished my thought for me, except that maybe Sal somehow learned about the pirate myth and took it a little too seriously, I added. Which doesn't make him any less crazy, Frank said. Nope. I dropped my bag in the aisle and started paging through the radio book. I stopped at an illustration of a figure in a long hooded robe holding a trident, a lot like the Admiral's. The figure had the face of a mouthless birdman with arched slits from eyes and a long crooked beak. A tingle of fear shot through me as I read the caption aloud. Ghouls such as this have been glimpsed haunting Bayport's darkest alleys after the midnight hour. Were they summoned from the underworld, as some suggest? Citizens are warned to venture out after sundown at their own peril. I guess people took things very seriously back then, Frank noted. I flipped past a few more pages before I saw something else that made me stop. The page was partially torn, but the important part was still intact. Dude, you said Delilah's family was big around Bayport way back in Admiral's day, right? I asked Frank. Yeah, they were supposedly one of the first families to settle the area. Why? I held the book open for him to read. Others made public accusations that Bryant and his cronies were cultists. Among the most prominent citizens who came under suspicion were Mayor Samuel Smithwick, Treasurer Jedi Coleman, and Constable Joel Foreman. Frank stopped reading. Wait, isn't Foreman Delilah Hickson's maiden name? Yep, I affirmed. Do you think Delilah and Layla could have been related to one of the Admiral's secret society brothers? Frank asked. It would help explain why Sal is so obsessed with the Admiral, I said. It would also mean he isn't all the way crazy. There really could be a link connecting Layla and Admiral Bryant, Frank said. If there's truth to that, do you think there could be truth to his other statements? Like there being some kind of secret city full of treasure, I asked. I don't. Frank stopped and looked up. Hey, did you hear something? Huh? Nah, dude. A second later, a book fell off the shelf above me, conking me in the head. What the? Watch out, Frank yelled, slamming into me just as an 8-foot bookshelf toppled over towards us. Luckily, my brother had been paying closer attention than I had. Frank tackled me, pushing me out of the way just in time to save me from being crushed by an avalanche of books. Thanks to my brother's quick reflexes, none of us were injured. When I looked up at him, he was staring past the fallen shelf with his mouth wide open. What just happened? I started to ask. But then I saw it too. Standing at the end of the aisle was a red-robed figure with a monstrous beaked face and no mouth. Just like the one in the book we've been reading. Only this ghoul wasn't holding a trident. It was holding the gear bag where I stashed the Admiral's key. Suddenly, Sal's belief that he was being haunted by the Admiral's ghost seemed a lot less crazy. I was so stunned. I just sat there staring. It has the key, Frank yelled, snapped me out of the daze. The ghoul fled through the stacks, and we took off after him. Or her, or whatever it was. The figure slipped through the back exit into the alley behind the historical society. We nearly lost track of it until I glimpsed its red robe up ahead. It's heading towards Central Station, I cried, pointing to the tall stone arches in front of Bayport's old train station. The ghoul may have gotten the drop on us in the library, but we were faster, and the distance between us was shrinking. It ran into the station through a side door, and we sprinted after it just a few seconds later. There weren't many people in the big old lobby, so the figure's red robe should have been easy to spot, only it wasn't. The thief had vanished. Where'd he go? I asked, skidding to a stop. Frank looked around, stumped. Maybe he slipped back out through a different door. We should have seen him. Let's check behind the benches in the restroom, I suggested. The thief wasn't anywhere to be found, but someone else we were looking for was. And when we came out of the restroom, we spotted a scuffy, disheveled-looking man with a ratty duffel bag hurrying across the lobby towards a bunch of old luggage lockers. Is that Sal? Frank asked. Sure is, I whispered, ducking behind one of the benches so he wouldn't see us. Let's see what he's up to before approaching him. Sal nervously looked around and headed straight for a shabby-looking locker with a sign on it that said, "Out of order." He glanced over his shoulder before opening the locker's doors. Frank and I spied from our hiding place, anxious to see what Sal was going to take out of the locker, only he didn't take anything out. Instead, he crawled inside and closed the door behind him. Huh? We both said at the same time. I mean, it's not every day you see a homeless guy climb into a luggage locker. We shook off our surprise and ran across the lobby to yank the locker door open, but it was empty. Am I dreaming, or did we just chase a ghoul into a train station and then watch a homeless guy disappear into a locker like Houdini? I asked Frank. That's it, Frank exclaimed. When Houdini disappeared, it was usually with the help of a well-disguised trapdoor. I watched as Frank tapped along the sides and bottom of the tin locker. Finally, he hit something that sounded hollow toward the back panel. Frank was right. Behind the panel, there was a hole with a ladder that stretched down into the pitch dark below. This wasn't a locker. It was a gateway to the underworld. Chapter 6. Stay tuned for Chapter 7. Bye.